The HOA sued me for excessively bright Christmas lights, and even called me a terrorist. They thought they could intimidate me. But in court I said just a few words, and Caldwell went pale, and on Christmas night I pressed a button, and the whole neighborhood saw who the real winner was. But let's start from the beginning. Jack Miller loved Christmas. No, he didn't just love it, he made it grand. To him, the holiday wasn't just a date on the calendar. It was a chance to create magic, a true light show that made kids squeal with joy and adults forget their worries, if only for a moment. Every year, his yard transformed into a miniature Las Vegas, but with taste. Twinkling string lights wrapped around trees, neatly arranged snowflakes on the lawn, a shimmering pathway, and, of course, his masterpiece, a giant LED screen displaying Santa Claus waving in sync with festive music. Everything ran flawlessly, without overloading the grid, because Jack was an engineer for the Department of Energy. He knew his stuff. His neighbors adored the tradition. Every evening, people gathered to witness the spectacle. Families posed for pictures, children twirled with excitement on the snow-covered sidewalks, and an elderly couple from the next block always stopped by to say that Christmas just wasn't the same without Jack's lights. But this year, the magic ended before it even began. One December evening, on his way home, Jack noticed something odd in his mailbox, a thick official envelope from the HOA, Homeowners Association. He frowned. HOA. These guys were notorious for their love of control. They could fine you for the wrong shade of your mailbox or the non-compliant color of your grass. Tearing the envelope open, Jack unfolded the letter and froze. Dear Mr. Miller, your Christmas decorations do not meet the neighborhood standards. Your lighting disrupts the aesthetic harmony and creates excessive illumination that disturbs residents. The HOA demands the immediate removal of all decorations. Failure to comply will result in fines of $5,000 per day until the lights are taken down. Sincerely, HOA. Jack reread the letter. Then again. Then let out a slow breath. Are you freaking kidding me? But that wasn't even the worst part. There was a second page attached. Additionally, your energy usage has been deemed excessive and unnecessary. The HOA classifies your Christmas lights as energy terrorism, as they contribute to light pollution that disrupts the neighborhood's way of life. Energy. Terrorism. Him? An engineer for the Department of Energy? A man who designed projects focused on energy efficiency and sustainability? Now, suddenly he was a terrorist? Jack stared at the paper, then slowly covered his face with his hand and laughed. The kind of wild, unhinged laughter that comes when you realize the world has officially lost its mind. So, I'm a terrorist now? He walked over to the hallway mirror, looked at himself, then put on a serious face, clasped his hands behind his back, and spoke in a deep, official voice. Mr. Miller, you are charged with the unauthorized use of holiday spirit and the unlawful distribution of joy. You have the right to an attorney, but even they won't save you from the soulless HOA overlords. He spun on his heel and slammed the letter onto the table. But, beneath the humor, anger was boiling inside him. He knew exactly who was behind this. The HOA had one man who wanted everything to fit inside his little gray box. A man who despised any form of joy that stood out. And that man was Richard Caldwell, the HOA president. A man who, if given the power, would probably fine people for smiling too much. Jack stepped outside and looked around. His house glowed in the darkness, covered in thousands of warm holiday lights. The stars reflected in the snowy drifts, and the air was filled with the laughter of children, excited shouts, and the soft jingle of bells. How could this possibly bother anyone? And more importantly, why now? No one had ever complained. Even his elderly neighbors, who went to bed early, had said the lights didn't bother them. They didn't flicker obnoxiously. They weren't blinding. They were expertly designed. Because he was an engineer, damn it. But this year, the HOA had decided they needed a new target, and if they thought Jack would just roll over and give up, they picked the wrong guy. Jack wasn't backing down. Jack was furious. And not just annoyed. He was shaking with rage. How was this even legal? The HOA was supposed to help homeowners, not stalk their lives like some predatory control freaks. He couldn't just let this slide. And soon, he found his answer. Richard Caldwell's name had been whispered around the neighborhood for years. The HOA president, a former attorney obsessed with control, the kind of man who despised anything that stood out, whether it was a brightly painted front door or an elderly couple's garden gnome collection. A petty dictator. If Caldwell could force every homeowner to paint their houses in the same dull beige and toss out every Christmas decoration, he would. But this time, he picked the wrong target. The first meeting, attempting peace. Jack decided to be rational first. He scheduled a meeting with the HOA board. That evening, he walked into a stuffy conference room inside the HOA office. 5 board members sat behind a long table, but at the center, Caldwell's smug face. His expression said it all. You've already lost. But Jack had no intention of losing. He spread out his documents. Let's talk facts, he said, sliding a folder onto the table. According to your complaints, my Christmas lights are too bright and disrupt the neighborhood's aesthetic harmony. He flipped open a report. But here's the official brightness measurement. My lights produce 40% fewer lumens than the standard streetlights in this very neighborhood. The board members remained silent. Jack continued. As for energy consumption, my decorations run on autonomous battery packs and solar panels. I use high-efficiency LED lights, consuming 5 times less power than the holiday lights installed on the HOA office itself. Then he looked directly at Caldwell. And if this is about light pollution, then why hasn't a single neighbor complained in the last 5 years? Caldwell leaned back, fingers interlocked, his face unreadable. But Jack could see it, that arrogance. Caldwell knew Jack was right. But he didn't care. Unmasking the real motive. Caldwell smirked. Very compelling arguments, Mr. Miller. He drawled his words like they were dripping with poison. But you don't quite understand the issue here. Jack raised an eyebrow. Oh? Then enlighten me. Caldwell leaned forward, his smile widening. It's not about electricity. It's not about regulations. He paused. You're disrupting the neighborhood's balance. Jack froze. Balance? Yes, Caldwell said with a condescending chuckle. It's gaudy. Gaudy? Jack couldn't believe his ears. Caldwell saw his reaction, and his smile grew wider. Your lights? They're loud, tacky. They make the neighborhood look cheap. Jack felt his blood boil. So this isn't about rules. It's about you hating my decorations? Caldwell shrugged. Call it maintaining standards. Jack clenched his fists. This wasn't about energy. This wasn't about complaints. It was about power. And Caldwell had just made a fatal mistake. He underestimated Jack Miller. Fine, Jack said, standing up. Caldwell's smug look wavered. Fine, Jack smirked. You want a court battle? You got one. Caldwell went pale. Now? The real fight had begun. Caldwell was certain he would win. The courtroom, bathed in stark overhead lighting, was packed. On the left side sat the HOA team, Caldwell, his attorneys, and a few neighbors he had dragged in as witnesses. On the right side sat Jack Miller. Caldwell lounged in his dark gray suit, one leg crossed over the other, exuding absolute confidence. He was sure his attorneys would crush this cocky engineer just as easily as he had crushed anyone who dared resist his rules. He had already played his game before the trial even started. He had gone around the neighborhood, suggesting that residents support the HOA in court. Some were promised fee reductions. Others were subtly threatened. If they didn't take his side, they might suddenly find themselves buried in violations for something as petty as their garbage cans being at the wrong angle. Jack looked at these people and saw right through them. They weren't here because they believed in the case. They were here because they had been bought or bullied. The judge entered, and the courtroom stood. The clerk announced the case. HOA versus Jack Miller. The game had begun. The HOA's case, a comedy of absurdity. The HOA attorney, a slick corporate lawyer who had probably defended Caldwell dozens of times, spoke first. He read the charges with a stone-cold face. Mr. Miller installed excessively bright Christmas lights that disturb residents, violate HOA standards, and create light pollution, which negatively impacts the health of the community. Jack raised an eyebrow. Light pollution? Then came the witnesses. First up was Mrs. Tracy, an elderly woman from across the street. I can't sleep at night, she whimpered, glancing at Caldwell like she was waiting for approval. The lights are too bright. They shine right into my windows. Jack clenched his jaw. What the hell? He knew for a fact that Mrs. Tracy's windows faced the opposite direction. Next up was Mr. Lawson, a middle-aged man who looked downright uncomfortable. I feel uneasy, he mumbled. We all agreed it was too much. Jack caught his eyes. Lawson immediately looked away. They were all lying, and Caldwell knew it. Jack takes the floor. The power shift. Now it was Jack's turn. He slowly rose, reached for his folder, and then, without even opening it, simply clasped his hands behind his back. The room fell silent. I am an engineer for the U.S. Department of Energy, Jack stated, looking directly at the judge. Caldwell flinched. My job is to design and implement energy-efficient technologies. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle over the courtroom. My Christmas display consumes 70% less energy than the streetlights in this neighborhood. One of the HOA board members shifted uncomfortably. Furthermore, Jack continued, I use eco-friendly battery packs. My home is completely energy independent. Silence. The judge frowned. Are you certain? Jack nodded. Absolutely. Here are the official reports. He laid out the documents on the table. The judge picked up the first sheet, skimmed it, and pursed his lips. HOA. Do you have any evidence proving that Mr. Miller's lights exceed acceptable brightness levels? The HOA attorney hesitated. Caldwell's face turned red. They had nothing. The knockout punch. Jack let the silence drag out. Then he leaned forward and delivered the final blow. And according to the Federal Civil Liberties Act, banning Christmas lights violates the First Amendment right to free expression. Caldwell froze. I am filing a countersuit for discrimination and abuse of power by the HOA. The courtroom erupted into whispers. The judge narrowed his eyes and turned to the HOA. Now, the spotlight wasn't on Jack. It was on them. Caldwell started to sweat. The HOA attorney glanced at his client, panic flashing across his face. The judge set down the papers and looked at the HOA board. Based on the presented evidence, the HOA has failed to justify its claims. However, he added, looking at Jack's documents, I do have concerns about the legality of your fines and enforcement practices. Caldwell went pale. Now it wasn't a question of whether he would lose. It was a question of how badly. Jack simply smiled. Everything had changed. Caldwell had lost, and Jack was about to finish him off for good. The trial ended in a total blowout. The judge ruled without hesitation. The HOA is guilty of issuing unjust fines and abusing its authority. All claims against Mr. Miller are dismissed. Furthermore, the judge turned to Caldwell, the HOA is required to cover all legal fees and compensate the defendant for damages. Jack almost heard the sound of Caldwell's ego shattering. The HOA president sat there ashen-faced, his clenched jaw betraying the rage bubbling inside him. His whole expression screamed, "How? How did he beat us?" Jack could have walked away, satisfied with his victory, but that wasn't enough. He stood, looked Caldwell straight in the eye, and smirked. "Well, gentlemen, Merry Christmas." Christmas night, the grand finale. Winter draped a thick layer of snow across the streets, turning the neighborhood into something straight out of a Christmas postcard. The air was crisp and still, broken only by the occasional laughter of children and the soft crunch of footsteps in the snow. The entire neighborhood had gathered in front of Jack's house. People murmured in anticipation, kids bounced with excitement, and parents stole quick glances toward Caldwell's house. Oh, he was there. Caldwell stood behind his window, his silhouette barely visible in the dim light, watching, knowing there was nothing he could do. Jack stood on his porch. In his hand was a remote control. He turned to the crowd, took a theatrical pause, and announced, "Ladies and gentlemen, I dedicate this show to everyone who believes in the magic of Christmas, and especially to those who tried to destroy it." He pressed the button, and the world exploded with light. The grand triumph. Jack's house burst into a symphony of brilliance. Not just random flashing, but a perfectly choreographed display. Trees shimmered in gold, snowflakes blinked in rhythm, and above it all, the giant LED screen came to life, revealing a single message. "Merry Christmas, Caldwell." The crowd erupted into applause and laughter. Music filled the air, every beat perfectly synchronized with the lights, mesmerizing even the most skeptical onlookers. Santa Claus and his reindeer danced across the facade, weaving through snowflakes, and at that very moment the sky opened up, sending fresh snow drifting down as if the universe itself had joined the celebration. And in the midst of all this joy, one man stood seething in silent fury. Caldwell, watching, powerless. His authority shattered. The end of HOA's reign. The next morning, the entire neighborhood buzzed about what had happened, about how Jack Miller put the HOA in its place, about how Caldwell never even stepped outside, about how the HOA had been humiliated. A month later, Caldwell resigned. The HOA never dared challenge Jack Miller again, and every Christmas, when Jack lit up his house, people knew it wasn't just a display, it was a symbol of victory, because Jack Miller didn't lose.